What I started doing instead was talking a little bit about the interviewing process, going through the basic steps of how an interview would go, and then leaving the rest of the session really open to answer your questions. The interviewing process starts your career. So it is the biggest part. After you graduate, the next big thing you do is go on interviews to start your career. And if you're interested in having a great career, that first company you go to work for is a very important company for you to work for. You're not learning necessarily so much about what you learned in school, although you will learn a whole lot more, because the business world is different than the academic world, and things don't go necessarily the way your textbooks tell you. But you're also learning how to work in the business world, which is different than the academic world. So there's a whole lot that you learn those first couple of years when you enter the business world. So getting that first job is really critical. Whether you hold it for just a couple of years or you end up staying there for long term, it's still a very important step to that career that you want to have. So I thought we would start with the first thing that opens a window, and that's your resume. And there's a lot of different thoughts on how a resume looks. And if you send it to a resume building company, if you send it to 5 different resume building companies, you end up with 5 different resumes. Why is that? That's because there's no standard resume that's the key to getting you hired. There are formats that one person might like better than another person. And because the person building your resume isn't the person reviewing your resume, that resume may or may not work. But there are some key things that are important to that resume. So if you send it to a resume building company, there are certain things that you want to make sure that they put on that resume. You want your name to be evident, and you want it to stand out, because you want them to not have to figure out where your name is on that piece of paper. That's why you typically see a resume with the name in bold at the very top. There's a reason for that. You want them to remember your name as they read that resume, or at least be able to find it fairly easily. So that's kind of an obvious. I think most people put their names towards the top, although I've seen some that don't come across that way. The next important thing to that resume is actually your experience. And coming out of college, you may not have that much experience. If you've worked internships or you've worked part-time jobs, then that's experience. And it's experience that you want to make sure you put in on that resume. If you don't have any real experience, you haven't worked any significant positions, then the next most important thing would be your education and any projects or anything that you've done while in the university. That would be the next biggest thing that you have to offer on your resume. But whatever that is, whether it's your experience that you've already gained or whether it's your projects and things that you did while you were gaining your degree, that's the most important thing you have to offer the individual. And what you want that resume to do is you want it to look so impressive that they're interested in picking up that phone and giving you a call or sending you an email or however they choose to get in contact with you. So if that's your goal, then obviously if you're in marketing, I'm sure they'd probably tell you there might be some marketing majors, but you don't want your best assets to be at the bottom because they may not ever get there. You want it to be the first thing that somebody sees. So outside of your name, whatever it is that you are bringing to the table needs to be the next thing that you highlight. And then from there, you can go down. Given you probably haven't had that much experience, your resumes are probably not going to be that long. But you don't want a resume to get too long. So if you're thinking, I'm going to go add a whole bunch of projects and stuff, and you end up with a 3-page resume, what I do with it is read the first page and set it aside. It either made it in the I'll consider pile or the ain't going to look at it too much on the page. So you don't want to put so much information on your resume that you make it too long. The key to that is if you've got your project or your experience, you want to highlight the big points in that and then move on to the next thing. That resume is not going to get you the job. The resume only opens a window to give you the opportunity to go in and talk to someone, and that's where you're going to get the job. You don't want the resume to say everything about you, because that's all there is. So you don't need it to go long and in depth. What you want it to be is eye-catching, have enough information on there that you can open that window and have someone give you a call.
Okay, very good points. Now, the question is, my students ask me all the time, I think the Career Center, I mean, it's just a standard recommendation is don't let the resume exceed 1 page. It's got to be a 1 page, because they won't pass that. You know, I mean, so I've had some students that really have quite a bit of experience and have done a lot. I said, don't worry about that. If you've got some really good stuff, don't just fabricate and come up with it. But if you've got some really pertinent information, don't go crazy about trying to keep it on 1 page. Now, that's my take on it. Now, what is it? Because I'll bet everyone here has this idea that, yeah, you got to keep the 1 page, because that's the rule. You know, that's what they tell us. What do you say to that?
Well, 1 to 2 pages is typically okay. You don't want to extend it to 2 pages if you can keep it to 1 page. And that's probably the better rule of thumb, isn't how many pages it is, but really how many pages does it need to be. And typically, when even people with a whole lot of years of experience, they can usually find a way to make it fit on 1 or 2 pages. So it is more about what you've put on the page than it is the length of the page. If your resume is good enough, then flipping that 1 page isn't going to be an issue. It's if your resume's got too much junk on it and the person looking at the resume has no interest in it because they're having to weed through too much. You'll want keywords in there. Keywords is a big thing nowadays. I don't know if the networking guy talked anything about it, but when we get resumes in today, a lot of recruiting departments actually have them in an electronic format, and they search for words. And then they pick their resumes based on whether or not your resume has those particular words in it. Now, what words are the keywords? Well, that really depends on what field you're in. If you're in sales, words that indicate that you're outgoing and you're aggressive, those types of words would be very important. I would not look for those words if I'm looking for someone to care for an elderly person. I don't want them to be aggressive. I would be looking for someone who has a more caring personality. So is there keywords? No, not for the entire business world. The words that are key are to your specific industry that you're attempting to enter into and what's big in that field today. Those are the words that you need to have on there. That's not that difficult to figure out on the internet. You can go, you can research, you can see what companies are putting down for job requirements on their ads when they're advertising for positions. So if you're in sales and marketing and you start looking for sales positions and you look at their ads, the keywords are typically right there in those ads. So you can take some of those words and incorporate it into your resume, and that's more likely to get your resume pulled up.
Okay, so you're saying that as you look at a resume, your eyes are focusing on these 4 keywords, or?
Yeah, they do. And typically nowadays it's done ahead of time because a lot of companies have recruiting departments, and the recruiting department simply is put in, it's electronic nowadays. And so they've got a word search. They search the resumes, and it pulls up only the resumes that have those words in it. If I'm manually doing it, then I'm doing the same thing. I'm looking for certain things, whether or not you have certain words in your resume that would indicate a certain type of individual. So word searches are really huge today because it's not so difficult to do that with modern technology. Most resumes are done electronically. Which means that if I end up with electronic copy, I can search that resume any which way I want to. That's why if you go online, most people want you to reply online. They don't want you to mail in. It used to be you had to send in a resume and wait to hear a response from it. And nowadays it's all done electronically, or at least the majority of companies do it electronically. And that's not just because you don't have to mail something in. It's because the companies themselves can search your resumes faster and eliminate the amount of people that they're actually physically looking at resumes for. So it is important that you have those keywords. Very easy to find. Go search for some ads for some positions that you're interested in. Look at what they have in those ads, and those typically have those keywords for the position you're looking for. So if you do have to print out your resume, if you're going to go to an interview in person, then you'll need to print out your resume still. They may not ask for it, but they may ask for it. There might be somebody in the interview who's not seen your resume, because oftentimes you might have one or two other people in that meeting with you to talk about your experience. And they may not have ever seen your resume. So you want to be able to hand your resume over to them so that as the interview is starting, they at least have the opportunity to scan and understand who they're talking to and what your experience level is. So it's still important that you be able to print out that resume, and you want it to look good. You don't want to put it on a cheap piece of paper, because that has a lot to say with how important this position is to you. So if you're going to print out that resume, you want to use a format that's easy to read, you want it to look nice, and you want a decent piece of paper. You don't have to buy the most expensive piece of paper out there. And I know that you can go to the Staples or Office Depot or whatever, office supply store, and get a fairly small pack of a heavier weight paper and print out. You're not going to need dozens and dozens of them typically nowadays. Most of it's going to be electronic format, but you will want to have at least a few on hand in case you do have to hand those out. So let's say that you actually did get through that resume process. You got a phone call. Now what? A lot of companies nowadays are doing phone interviews. And a phone interview is typically a whole lot shorter than the actual interview. It may be 15, 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes. Depending on the individual who you're speaking to. A lot of times nowadays you're speaking to a recruiter and not to the person who's going to hire you. You haven't gotten that far up. A lot of companies today have at least one recruiter. Even smaller companies nowadays have at least one recruiter typically. So you're not talking to the hiring manager. Now that doesn't mean that you won't. And there are still companies where the hiring manager does all of the hiring. You may be talking to the person you'd interview with. But for the most part, we can say that you'll be talking to a recruiter before you ever talk to the person you're managing. It's important because that recruiter is going to help open that door. So you want to make sure that when you're talking to that recruiter on the telephone, that they're getting the vital information that you need. It's actually your first opportunity to sell yourself and let them know why you're a better candidate and you should be called in for that interview. It is part of the formal interview process. No matter how friendly they sound, no matter what subjects they bring up, it's a formal process, and they are actually grading you on how well you're doing in that conversation. So that will determine whether or not you get a call back to actually come and interview with the manager who is hiring for that particular position. Those phone interviews are usually going through the minimum requirements and seeing if you actually meet those minimum requirements. And if it's a situation where you might have to move in order to take that position, they usually try to find out if you're open to that move. It's not located maybe in the vicinity of where you live. And typically, a company will want to know whether or not you're really willing to move. Now, assuming that you sent your resume in, there's an assumption that you are, but in some cases that's not actually the way it pans out. So typically, that's what that first phone interview is for. It's for those basic requirements. This is where the position is. This is what the position does. They try to give you a better idea of what you would be doing in this particular position. And they don't usually cover salary ranges, but some companies they do in that conversation. And they find out what experiences you have, what your education is, those types of things. And then that conversation actually ends. It's a pretty easy conversation. I don't think you have to really study very hard for that. Usually, it's everything you already know off the top of your head. That's usually a fairly easy one to get through. As long as you remain polite and you sound confident, you're probably going to get through that phone interview pretty easily. The next step, though, is the biggest step you have, and that's where you're hoping to open up that door and gain that job. And that's when you go in for the actual interview itself. And usually when you go in for the interview, you are at minimum, like I said earlier, interviewing with the manager who's going to hire you and maybe some other individuals. Who would the other individuals be? It might be a peer. It's very common for them to bring one of their best employees into the interview process. Sometimes they call them leads or seniors, but they've got a lot of experience. They know more hands-on what you're going to be doing in that position. And so they bring them in there to help answer and fill out what you actually know versus what you do not know. So that's typically the role of that other individual. One other individual who may or may not be in that interviewing process is an HR manager. And the HR manager is there to do more than one thing. They may be evaluating your responses, and they're also evaluating how their manager is doing in the interview process. So they serve dual roles. So they'll be listening, they might be asking questions, and they do tend to have input in whether or not that individual is hired. So those are typically the people who are in the interview itself. When you go to the interview, you need to make sure that you are dressed appropriately for that interview. That does not mean that you have to dress up, but it would depend on what that company does, but you would want to typically wear something other than jeans and a t-shirt. That would not be very good interviewing style. And you think, gosh, why would she ever say that? Who would go like that? Well, there's been a lot of people who come in and they don't dress the part for the interview. An interview is a formal meeting, and it requires you to actually take some time and plan out whatever you want to wear. Now, I say it doesn't have to be formal because you could wear, in some cases, say for a male, khakis and a polo shirt, a nice polo shirt. And that would be appropriate for that particular company. In another company, you might actually have to wear something more towards the formal side, where you have to wear a button-down shirt and a nicer pair of dress pants. There are still a few companies out there where you actually have to wear a suit and tie if you were a guy. And for the females, a nice pantsuit or dress or skirt that looks nice, and then all the way up to something that's more of a business suit for a female, depending on the company. Now, luckily, in today's world, there's not a whole lot of times where you actually have to put on the suit and tie type thing. So your best thing is, if you're going to the interview, you ask them what the dress style is for that company, so that you're mimicking what most people in that company look like. Most companies are business casual nowadays, which means khakis and polo shirts, typically what you see a lot of people in. But depending on what that business is and what field you're going into, it may require a different type of dress. In sales interviews, they're still coming in a lot of times in suits and ties, simply because it's all about the presentation. So it really does depend what you're entering into. But you can call the company, or when you're talking to the person on the telephone and you remember and you're setting up that interview, at that point in time, you can ask them what the dress should be. And that's a perfectly okay question to ask. If you're not wanting to ask that question, you think it sounds kind of strange, I don't think I want to ask that particular question, then you need to go on the higher side, not on the lower side. Maybe not the full suit and tie, but you'd need to put on a pair of dress pants or a nice dress skirt, something like that, so that you're at least dressed. It's okay to be dressed over. It's not okay to be dressed under. So that would be the rule of thumb. Overdressing is okay. It shows initiative, shows desire for the position. Underdressing shows you really don't care, and I probably don't have any interest in you either. So it's very, very key. When you enter that building for wherever you're interviewing, the moment they lay eyes on you, you've already made that first impression. It happens that fast. Before you ever open your mouth, you've already made that first impression. Even if the manager hasn't seen you, if you go in and there's a receptionist, the moment she sees you, you've made the first impression, because she's going to call back and they're going to ask her what they think of that particular candidate. And most people don't realize it because they don't think that that person's doing the interviewing, so I can do whatever I want here. I have to start to be on my best behavior as soon as the individual comes out. But that's not the way the real world works. As soon as you appear, any individual that sees you could impact that decision. So you want to make sure that you're prepared to go the minute you walk in that door. When you walk in the door and you actually meet with the individual who's going to actually do the interview itself, it's still a formal process regardless of how it goes. And I wish there was one format that I could come into a class and say this is exactly how it's going to go. But you've got people out there who've never had a course in interviewing and the proper ways of interviewing candidates. And then you've got people who've specialized in it. So if you interview with an HR person, you're probably going to get a completely different interview than maybe what you get with a manager. And because you've got so many people doing so many different types of interviews, there's really not one format that you're going to enter into. What you need to remember is that it's always a formal process. No matter how comfy and cozy it feels, you're still being graded, and they're still determining whether or not they want you in that position. And I can't tell you how many times people have thought they've had a job because they thought they were just about best friends with that interviewer, just to find out that someone else got that position. And that's because you get a little too comfortable, you let too many things slide out, and then you're not the candidate that they really want for the job. So when you meet them, you want to give a good handshake. They'll take you back to the place where they're going to interview you. They may take you around the building. And then you'll go back to the place. They'll probably offer you something to drink. If you need something to drink, it's okay to take it. You know, oh, no, I can't do that. They're asking you that for a purpose. From the interviewer's standpoint, what I want to achieve is to get you relaxed so that you're willing to talk to me. Because in the end, what's happening is you're trying to decide whether or not my company is the right company for you. What I'm trying to decide is whether or not you're the best candidate for the position that I have available. So we're on equal grounds in that meeting. If you're really nervous, you're not going to talk to me. And I could say no to my best candidate without ever realizing that you're actually the best candidate that I had out there because you were too nervous. So the point in asking you if you want something to drink is because sometimes someone having something in their hands helps them relax a little bit. So if you want something to drink, then say, yeah, a glass of water would be great. Or if you think that your voice might get too dry or something like that and a glass of water would help, certainly you can take whatever it is that they're offering. They're just trying to put you at ease. It's not a trick question. I get that asked sometimes. Is that kind of a trick question? It's not a trick question. They'll start the process. Hopefully they'll start the process by letting you know a little bit about the company and a little bit about the position. They might ask you some general questions about yourself, like tell me a little bit about yourself, or tell me a little bit about what you've been doing in college or something of that nature. And that is, those are what we call opening questions.
Okay, so yeah, the couple questions, just what you mentioned, I thought it was interesting. I've had some students say they had an interview and said, man, it went great. Personalities, it just went great. We laughed a lot, it was very friendly. And what you just said, that's not necessarily, so when they come out of the interview, because they had this connection, this relationship, it seemed to gel so nicely, they were confident that, I'm probably going to get this. But what you're saying, that doesn't necessarily mean that they may have gone too far in their friend. And it does not necessarily mean, right?
Yes.
Okay, the second question is, when you said,
The opening questions, like.
Here's the other opening question that drives students crazy. Tell me a little bit about yourself, or describe yourself. So I've had students say, well, where do I start on that? You know, what am I supposed to do? What are they really looking for when that question's asked? And I think that's a very typical question. And I want to see what you're going to say about yourself. Where does a person actually start? And what do they really want you to say? Or what should they say?
Well, what they're doing is they're trying to break the ice, and they're trying to get you to talk about something that you're familiar with yourself, not related to the job, not whether or not you're good for the job. They're really just trying to break that ice. It's not a great question, and an HR manager would probably tell them, let's think about a different question, because what that can lead to is a whole lot of illegal answers that we really don't want to hear. So it's not the best question. What they don't want to know is they don't want to know your age, your race, your nationality, and where you've been living for the past 10 years, and they don't want to know any of that kind of stuff, because now we're getting into all of the topics that are illegal, and now I've got to do something with that information to ensure that it's not handled in an illegal or inappropriate manner. What they really want to know is they want to know who you are. So, well, I've been at the UGA, I majored in such and such, I participated in such and such activities, you know, those types of things that maybe are more personal to you, but it's not age, rank, serial number, and those types of things. We want to stay away from those. They're not the best questions, but I can tell you they're very, very common. Every time I enter an interview with a manager, I would say the majority of the time, they ask a question like that. They will say, so tell me a little bit about yourself. And I honestly, I just want to go, oh my gosh, here we go. Okay, let's hope that we don't get something that we don't want to hear, because it's too broad of a question. But really all they want you to do is open up, is to feel comfortable with the interview process. Some people will actually start with, if you're wearing something that would indicate a team that you like or something like that, then they might actually start on that particular sport. Often they'll talk, if it's a football game that was recently played, then that might be the first topic. It's not whether you agree with who won or lost, it's just something that they thought you might be interested in talking about. And if they can get you interested in talking, when they start into the formal questions, you'll be able to continue on with the conversation and you won't freeze up. Because the worst thing that can happen in the interview process is for you to freeze up. You're not going to end up with the interview going well. They're not going to know whether or not you're really a good candidate, and we're going to go downhill from that part. So that's what the point of those initial conversations are. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't get those. So the other way an interview starts is, okay, so I see you have a degree. What was your GPA? And they start right into it. And it's like, boom. And they haven't prepared you. And again, you're going to get both types of styles depending on who you interview with and how much experience they actually have in the interviewing process and how much training they've actually had in it. So you're probably going to get a variety. It's not going to sound all professional, maybe like some of the classes or things that you've taken. It does, in the real world, that doesn't always happen that way. So after they do the breaking the ice section and they try to get you to calm down and not feel so nervous, then they're going to get into the actual questions, and they're going to ask you about your experience, and they're going to ask you about anything related to what you've done here at the university. And they may get into any type of extracurricular activity that you've had. All of that plays a part in whether or not you fit for that position. And if you're thinking, well, what does my extracurricular activity have to do? Well, it has a lot to do. Because if you've played on any sort of team or you worked on any type of team, it tells us whether or not you're good at teamwork. And in most cases, you're working on a team when you enter the business world. So it's very important that we know how well you do at working on a team. And if you're a good team player, if you pitch in, if you do your share. So any type of activity that you've done in your history really plays into that type of information for the interviewer. When they get through the interviewing questions, then typically what they tell you is what the company has to offer you. So they'll talk about the benefits, They'll talk about, they may talk about salary depending on what grade level you're coming into the company at. Many times they don't, but in certain positions they will talk about it during that first interview process. And then they'll ask you if you have any questions. You had a question?
Yeah, if you're at like recently I did like the third round of interview. I did a phone interview, then I met with people on campus, and then went to their offices.
Mm-hmm.
And through the whole time, I wasn't sure like whether or not I did. After the whole interview, they never told me how much I would be getting paid in the internship if I got it. And one of the things when they asked me kind of questions, one thing I thought about, I didn't ask it, but I was wondering, do you think you should ask how much is getting paid if you're at that point, you're at like one of the main interviews and you don't know it yet, and really you could get a call maybe the next day on accept it or not, and you might still never know how much it'd be.
Yeah, can you repeat the question so we can pick it up on the tape?
Okay, so the question was, if you're in the interviewing process and they've never let you know how much you're going to make for the position that you're offering, is it okay to ask that during the interviewing process? And the answer is yes. Typically, it's better if you ask the question, because you can ask what the salary range is for that position. So it's okay for you to go ahead and ask that question. Now, I wouldn't do, if it's your first interview, unless there's only one interview, then I wouldn't pose that question. If there's going to be 2 interviews, then I'd wait for the second interview before I ask that question. If there's only one interview, then that's the only opportunity you have to ask if they do not bring up the subject. It's really good if you ask the question instead of them asking you. It puts you on the better side, because when they ask you, then you're sitting there with, well, gosh, I really don't know how much this position is going for versus what they're paying. You may not be prepared to answer that question. So it's usually better if you get that question out there, and then they can tell you the range. And typically companies talk in ranges, they don't talk in flat dollar amounts. And the reason they talk in ranges is because one individual with less experience might be towards the bottom of the range, where someone with more experience may get hired on at the top of the range. So there's usually not one set rate. There's usually a range. Now, there are some positions that are paid on pay plans, and there's one rate, and you're hired in at that rate. Most positions are not on that type of a pay plan, and there's typically ranges that are associated. So they'll give you the range, and then you'll know whether or not it's what you were thinking of. So it's excellent to ask that up front. Especially once they ask what the benefits are, and if you they tell you what the benefits are, and then they ask you if you have any questions. When they do ask you if you have any questions, it's important for you to have some questions available. If you're going into that interview process and you don't have any questions, then what that tells the interviewer is you didn't research the company. If you didn't research the company, then you probably don't have very much interest in the company. And my next question to myself is, why am I wasting my time on you? So you do want to have some questions prepared. They don't have to be really amazing questions. It just should show that you've done a little bit of research on that company. You might want to ask them how they are doing according to the competitors in their industry. Are you the top-ranked company now? Or, you might want to have some of those types of questions. I saw that your EBITDA is at such and such. How does that compare to the competitors? Any type of question like that would show that you have looked into that company and you at least know who you're interviewing with, instead of I just ran through the jobs on some of the internet pages and I just started applying to whatever I could find, and you just happened to be one to call me. You don't want to give that impression, because that's a bad impression to give to a potential employer. So before we close out the interview process, the other thing that I wanted to make sure that I mentioned is the behaviors in the interviewing process. Because the behaviors speak a lot louder than most of the things you say. Now, there are some things that you can say that'll kill the interview. But a lot of times what kills an interview is your body posture, because that speaks a lot more than many of the things you say. So when you go into an interview, if you're leaning back in a chair, it says that I'm casual about this. I don't know that I really care about this job. I may or may not be interested. And when I get there, I may or may not perform. I'm not really sure. So you don't want to lean back in the chair. You want to make sure that you're sitting up straight. When you sit up straight, it says that I have interest in the job. Better yet, if you sit up straight and you sit forward from your chair, it says I have interest in the job and I'm excited. If you keep your hands folded, which is a bad habit of mine because I'm always cold. There's never a building I go into that I actually am warm, and so I've always got my arms folded because I'm trying to stay warm. But in an interview, that's not a very good posture to have. If you keep your arms up tight, it says that I'm closed, I'm hiding something, I'm not telling you everything that I should be telling you, and it's not a very good posture for you to have during an interview process. You want to make sure that your body language remains open. When you're talking, you want to make sure that you look at the individual and you make eye contact with that individual. If you don't make eye contact with the individual, then again, we go back to, okay, are you being honest with your answer or are you making something up? Do you not have experience in this area and you're trying to play your way around the question? Or are you too shy? And therefore, maybe you won't work well on a team because you won't speak out when it's necessary.
Sometimes when I'm like thinking in an interview, how long can you look away for, like at the ground or something? Like, what kind of like window do you have where you're not giving them the message where you're like not talking to them? Because sometimes I have to look away when I'm talking just so that I can think without them, like without thinking about them. You know what I mean?
Think of it in a, so the question, I'm sorry, the question was, because it may not have played on the microphone, the question was how long can I look away from somebody if I'm thinking about an answer before I actually have to look back and make eye contact again. And the way I would look at that is the way a normal conversation goes. And in a normal conversation, you expect an individual to make eye contact with you for a certain amount of times. For them to actually show interest in the conversation that you're having. And if you ask them a question and they look down and then they look back up, there's a certain amount, there's might be 10 seconds or so, which in silence is quite a bit of time. Sounds like a very short period of time, but it's actually quite a bit of time. So if I look down for about 10 seconds and come back up, at somewhere around 10 seconds, you're going to be wanting that eye contact to happen again.
Sometimes I continue talking when I'm looking away because they're looking at their face might make me nervous. I might lose what I'm saying. I don't know. That's probably okay, right? It's just like I don't know. I might be overthinking eye contact.
So the question was if I'm nervous and so I'm looking away when talking to them versus looking at them, is that okay?
Not all the time, but just
some of the time. So it depends how often that is happening. If it's very regular, then they may assume that you might not be being truthful with your answers. So you're going to have to train yourself to get over that so that you have normal eye contact in a normal conversation. Because that's really what you want it to be, because that shows confidence. When I look away, even if they think you're very honest, you're a great guy, what they might be thinking is he may not be able to handle conflict. And there's going to be conflict in this position. And he keeps looking away, so I don't know that he can handle it. That's where body language says a whole lot, and you don't realize what you're saying to someone when they're actually looking at you. So there are certain behaviors that we all have. Some of them we know we have. Others we have no idea. If you ask your friend, they can tell you all about it. But there are certain behaviors that you have. The best way to practice interviewing is to interview with somebody you know, or ask yourself questions in the mirror and see what kind of response you're getting from that mirror. It works really better if you've got someone who you can interview with, who doesn't mind hurting your feelings and telling you what you're actually doing. But some of those behaviors you're actually going to want to correct because they won't go well in an interview. The problem with the interview situation is the person you're interviewing may have never seen you ever at all, and so they don't know you, and they don't know what kind of person you are. And you could be the best person that's ever walked this earth, but they don't know that. And in that short period of time that you have to interview, there's only so much that they're going to find out about you. So any body language that you give that has a negative connotation will probably be taken that way. So if there's certain behaviors that you have, like if you get nervous and you twist your hair all the time, some females do that, they start twisting their hair, then you're going to want to recognize that that's what you do because you don't want to do that during an interview. You want it to be professional, and you want to give the best interview that you can give. So some of those types of behaviors you'll probably have to practice on. Some people do a great job interviewing. I wish I was one of those people, but I am probably like many of you, even though I've been in the field for forever. When I have to go to my next interview, I freeze up. And I could be out in the hallway and talk your ear off, and then we go to the interview, and I'm like, oh my gosh. So it doesn't matter if you're entering into a new position or if you've been in your industry for years. Interviewing is a very nerve-wracking process to go through. The secret here is the person you're interviewing with is often just as nervous as you are. Most of those managers don't like that interviewing process. And what they're trying to do is get that right person for their position. And if they always hire the wrong person, then that's noted. And we might not consider them to be very good for their position. So they've got stuff riding on the line as well. And they are often just as nervous during that interview process as you are. So the more they can key it down and make it more like a conversation, the better both individuals are in that interview. So if you sit up and you sit towards the edge and you look interested in whatever the interviewer is discussing, then they're going to assume that you're more interested in that position. So that's a really big key to the interviewing process. And so then after we close the interview off, you leave the company. They'll probably give you, although not all of the time, most of the time they'll try to give you some type of timeline of how fast they want to fill that position. Most of them will say as quickly as possible, but they usually have interviews set up for a week or for 2 weeks, depending on schedules and things. And so they usually have an idea of when they're going to be through that interviewing process. If they haven't given you that information, then you can always ask for that during the interviewing time. That way you know when you'll hear back from that company. Some companies will respond whether you get the interview or not. Unfortunately, not all managers do. Some managers only call the individual that they're interested in hiring, and you may not ever hear back from that company. Not the appropriate way to handle it, but it is the reality of the business world and different levels of managers that are out there. So when you get back, the first thing that you want to do is you want to put together a thank you letter. Because you're not the last person most of the time that they're interviewing. And there's 2 spots that are really good: the first interview and the last interview. The first interview because you're the first person they're talking to and they're really excited. The last interview because you're the last person they're talking about and you get the last word. Most of the time, you're probably not going to hit that first or last interview. You're going to be somewhere in the middle. But regardless of where you're at, you want them to remember you. And the only way you're going to get them to remember you more so than any other candidate is for you to remind them that you existed and why you are so good for that position. And that's what that thank you letter should say. You should thank them for taking the time to talk to you and about sharing their opportunity. And when you get through that sharing the opportunity part, you want to say why you are the best candidate for that position. You want to remind them of the key things that you said that they said. So your words should mimic their words. If they say that they need somebody that has X, Y, and Z in your thank you letter, you want to point out that you had X, Y, and Z. So that they can see that you're a perfect match for that particular position. And then that way, if they call you for that second interview or they call you for a possible position, you're certainly the one that did stand out. And you have that opportunity, and then now it's up to you on whether or not you want to take that position. Okay.
What do you think the timeline is for sending that, the follow-up?
Within a week of the interview.
Okay.
If you wait past a week, then it looks like you've forgotten, or they may have already made their decision. Because sometimes they move pretty fast, so I would do it within a week. I wouldn't do it the very next day, because I look too anxious, but I would do it within that week.
What would be better, an email or an actual letter?
So the question was, how do I send my thank you letter? email or an actual paper letter. It doesn't matter which way nowadays. If you've got their email address, then you can send it via email. Or if you don't have their email address, which in some cases you don't, they haven't given it out, you have the recruiter's email address, but you don't have the manager's email address. In that case, you'd want to send it to the manager, not to the recruiter. You don't need the recruiter remembering who you are, even though they are an important person. By the time you've gotten to the manager, it's more important to impress that manager. So if you don't have the manager's email address, then you'll want to send a hard copy thank you letter to the company addressed to that particular manager. Okay, so that ends that entire process in a very quick nutshell. I kind of pared it down significantly because I wanted to make sure that we had time to go through a lot of the questions that typically come up. So this is where I'm going to open it up. Since I took us through the process quickly, open it up and ask for any questions that you might have going through that process, or some of the things that scare you about the interviewing process that maybe we can chat about. So,
when you have questions for them, is it bad to ask questions that could easily be researched?
the question is it bad to ask questions that could easily be researched? That really depends. If you didn't research the company at all, yes. If you've done some research and you know some of the information, but there's other information that may have been as easily found, but you didn't find it, then not necessarily. But it depends how much information you've already given out about the company. So the way I would handle that is I would give out my information that I already know about the company, so that I have shared with them that I have researched them. And then if I ask other questions that might be easily found, it just means that I happen to overlook it, which is okay because that happens in any type of situation. But I would give out my information first. Another question?
Like you said earlier, that in the interview sometimes they say, tell us a little about yourself. Now, you said there's some questions that you don't want to, like an answer you do not want to hear. What are some answers that we should give and what we should not give? Just like basic information that would be good for them to know about us, and what they don't need to know about us, they don't want to know.
Okay, so the question is, what answers do interviewers not want to hear versus what should we tell them about ourselves that they may want to hear? So the questions that interviewers don't want to hear are things that fall underneath the EEOC regulations. So we don't want to know if you have any type of disability. It's illegal for us to know that information. The only thing that we need to know is whether or not, with or without accommodation, you can do your job. This job that you're interviewing for, can you do it with or without accommodation? And from an interviewing standpoint, that's all I want to know. So if you have some type of disability, and I don't care what the disability is, I don't want to know about that during the interview process. I don't want to know about any illnesses you have, anything like that. I also don't want to know any illnesses or disabilities that anybody in your family has. And you're thinking, why is this all so important? Because these are all things that could end up coming back against the company if someone wanted to sue the company because they did not get the job. And then we end up having to prove that that information was not relevant to the interview, nor was it used in the hiring decision process. So you don't want to have anything to do with the medical world. That whole medical HIPAA, if you've ever been to a doctor, you have to sign a HIPAA form. All that is protected information, and companies don't want to know anything about medical issues or disability issues. They don't want to know anything about your family either, because then we go back into things that are covered underneath EEOC. And the EEOC, if you haven't taken a course on it, are things like your nationality, your race, sex, those types of things are covered underneath that. And companies cannot ask questions related to that. So a question that would be sex related that might come up. They're not going to say, are you male or female? That's not going to be the question. The way that question would come up in an interview would be if I have a position where there's some heavy lifting. It may not be all the time, but every now and then there might be some heavy lifting. If you get into the chemical world and you're doing hazardous waste, you may, depending, even if you're a chemist, you may end up having to do some heavy lifting at some point in time. So the way that question becomes illegal is I ask you if you would be able to meet that job requirement. It is a job requirement. Can you lift 50 pounds or more? And then you're going to respond. I don't ask you. I assume you can. The question is now illegal. And that's how those questions work. So those are the types of things that people don't want to know. We don't want to know anything underneath that. If your family falls underneath that, because it goes underneath nationality. It doesn't matter where you grew up. It doesn't matter where you went to school, if you went in the United States or somewhere else in the world. All of that falls underneath nationality, and it can go into discrimination. And a company doesn't want anything that could be considered discrimination coming up in an interview process. What they do want to hear about is what you did at the university, what activities you were involved in, if you worked with any charities, if you worked on any teams, any type of experience that you have, as long as what you're giving is somehow job related. And that's the best way to phrase your answers. Unless they're talking about the latest football game at the very beginning, which you're probably okay with. When you get past that, the way you should think is what I'm about to tell them, is it job related? I don't need to know if you're married or single. I don't need to know if you have 10 kids or no kids, or you never wanted kids, or it's irrelevant. It has nothing to do with what I'm hiring you to do. And that's where you need to stay focused. If you get off on tangents, then typically the interview starts to go south. That's when it really feels good, because you're talking about all sorts of things that you can relate to, and there's probably not very many interview questions being asked, and you're thinking, we really hooked, we connected, I got this job, and you never get called back, because none of the information that you gave was relevant to that position. You didn't sell yourself on the position, you told them all about your personal life. So I would keep it to what's related to the job, and if what you're telling them has nothing to do with the position that you're taking, I would stay away from it, because it could be uncomfortable for the company, and you don't want that experience for the company that you want to hire you on. Another question? Yes.
This is kind of going back to what you were talking about, the resumes. I've had varying opinions on whether to use a photo of yourself on the resume, even if you only use one page. Would it be beneficial or not really to use a picture?
Pictures are, the question was, should I use the photo on my resume whether it's one page or not? And pictures are an iffy thing on a resume, because it tells someone who you are, shows them what you look like, but you haven't even said hello. So unfortunately, if the world was perfect and it operated the way it should, then it really wouldn't matter whether or not you saw my face, and I would probably get the job. Unfortunately, that's not the real world. The real world says that I might not like the way you look, and you haven't even opened your mouth yet, and I may turn your resume down. So it's not necessarily the best thing to put on your resume, because what you don't want is, you don't want to get the job because of the way you did or did not look in that particular photo, or because someone doesn't like something about you that's in the photo. And when you go and meet someone in person, you have that opportunity to let your personality show, and a photo doesn't really give you that opportunity. So it's not that it's good or bad. It probably just does not necessarily open up. People think if they saw me, then they relate to me and they remember me, and that doesn't necessarily always happen. You don't know how someone's going to react to that, so it's better to leave it off. The other thing it does is, if you put your photo on and someone else puts their photo on, and let's say they hit one of the other EEOC categories, then they could say, well, they knew, let's say they knew that I was over the age of 40, and so they didn't give that job to that person, they gave it to you because they could see what age you were. They didn't even let me interview. So it's not always the best thing to do. I would suggest leaving the photo off of it. That doesn't mean that they're not going to figure out what you look like, because we do use Facebook, and we do go on to all those other things. So the company may know what you look like before you go to the interview, but I wouldn't put it on that formal document. Yes?
When you're talking about resumes, you're saying put important information up top. Like, how important do you think GPA is when you're looking at a resume?
So the question is, how important is GPA on a resume? Well, that really depends what your GPA is. If I've got a GPA that's really stellar and it's exciting to talk about, then I'm probably going to put it closer to the top. I'm probably going to put my degree with my GPA right underneath it. But unless it's really impressive and you're an average student, all that says at the top of the resume is I am average. And it doesn't make me look stellar. So it really depends what that GPA is. Anything you put at the top, you want to make it shine. You don't want to look average. You want to look better than average. So whatever your grades are will determine where, or even if you want to put it on a resume. The thing about GPAs is it's important to you right now because you're graduating, you're about to graduate, you're starting your education, whatever place you are. So it's very important. When you get that first job, it's often a question in that interview process because you don't have as much experience for the person to go on. Once you get established in your career, that GPA goes out the window. Then it's more based on your experience. So right now, because you might be going up against other people who have graduated about the same time you have, if you put your GPA on there and it's average, and this other person puts their GPA on it and it's stellar, you don't look necessarily so good. So you don't want to put it towards the top or even on your resume, depending on what it actually says. What other questions do we have? Yes, ma'am.
If when they ask you if you have any questions, do you ask about like other opportunities that you might have in the company in the future? Does that come off as ambitious, or does that come off as not really exciting what you're talking about?
Most of the time it comes off as ambitious. So let me repeat the question so we know what we're talking about. The question was, if you ask about other opportunities in the company when you're interviewing for that first opportunity, what way does it come off of? And typically, it's something I would want to hear. What other opportunities do you have? What is the growth potential in the company? Are standard questions that I would expect to hear from the interviewee. Because it not only does it show ambition, but it shows your interest in the company. If you want to know where I have growth potential, then chances are you want to stay long enough to grow with the company. And I'm not looking for an individual who wants to stay 1 or 2 years. I'm looking for an individual who is going to put into the company what I am putting into them. Other questions?
Maybe like go-to or the questions you like to hear those people ask you? Because I think it's important to come with questions, but is there any that you like to hear? Or any like maybe go-to ones we should ask?
I don't think that there's a specific set of questions that I personally have ever looked for. Usually when they're asking questions about the growth of the company, that usually stands out. If they know where the company currently is at and where it's going, then that shows some interest in the company long-term versus short-term. Someone who doesn't have as much interest in the company may not be concerned with the business plan and where we're wanting to take the company. So that would be one that shows some initiative, some interest in the company, and the desire to grow with the company. Any questions that you ask that shows a desire to grow with the company are typically good questions to ask during an interview. What other questions do we have?
You said that when you ask somebody if they want water, it's not a trick question. Are there any trick questions that an interviewer would ask us?
Okay, so the question is, are there any trick questions that an interviewer could ask you? I don't know that there are trick questions as much as there are some questions sometimes that mean a whole lot more. And if you answer the question incorrectly, it could kill the interview. So I was doing some interviewing for a position recently. I happened to be in one of my facilities, and they asked if I could sit in. And one of the questions they asked was to the interviewees was just a simple question about if your manager had instructed you to fudge some numbers for the air permit requirements, and you said no. And they said, no, go ahead, I'm telling you that's what I want you to do. What would you do? So that really was a simple question, but there was only one answer we were looking for. So if you said, well, if I told you several times, no, I didn't feel comfortable with it, but in the end, well, okay, I guess I have to because you're my manager, then you immediately fell off the boat. I was not going to consider you for that interview. It wasn't a trick question. It was a very significant question because we were looking for supervisors and managers, and we wanted someone who was ethical, and it was an ethical question because the real answer for a question like that would be if it's wrong, it's wrong. I'm not going to do it. I'll have to take it above your head. I'll have to report to somebody else. So it's not, they're not necessarily trick questions, but there do tend to be important questions. If you answer them incorrectly, it does take you off the slate. Other questions?
Here's your chance now. Come on, ask. I was looking at some of the questions that the class has asked in the past, which I sent you, and Ms. Felske was kind enough to address them all. Some of them come up already. You've covered most of them. I was just trying to see if there was anything else, because we probably have 50 or 60 or 70 questions here that students in this class in the past have asked. Should you bring your ID? I'm desperate. I'm just looking for, well, that's, should I bring a pen? Should I bring a briefcase?
All right, so what should you bring to an interview? When you're going to an interview, typically a small notebook that where you can put your resumes in and any reference information, copies of certificates, things of that nature that may be relevant to that position, some type of folder or binder that you can keep that information in. Obviously, you're going to want something to write with because even if you filled out an application, they still make you fill out a physical application for legal reasons. Some companies still require that you fill out and physically sign an application. So you'll probably want some type of writing utensil with you as well. But other than that, you really don't need to bring anything else to that interview process. IDs are not necessary for the interview process, nor should you be sharing your IDs with anybody during the interview process because that is confidential information, and the only time that is needed legally is after they've made a job offer. So if they say, okay, I'm interested in hiring you for the position, I just need you to pass the background checks, so I'll need your IDs. At that point in time, they've made you a job offer, and all you're having to do is go through the background check. But if they haven't made you a job offer, then legally they should not be asking for any IDs. So you should not need IDs when you go through the interviewing process itself.
What about piercings and tattoos and things like that? And how important is that? Do you try to cover them up, have them removed?
Okay, so when it comes to your appearance is one of the things that, whether we like it or not, you're actually judged on in the interview process, and goes back to looking professional. So if you have tattoos and a lot of piercings and things, I suggest you find a way to cover them up or remove them, whatever you need to do for that interviewing process. Depending on what position you're being hired for, depends on how long you have to keep those things covered up. If you're facing the public, then a whole bunch of tattoos and earrings or whatever it is that goes on today is not considered a good thing. So if your position that you're looking for is one where you face the public, you'll want to make sure that you have the ability to always look professional, and whatever you've chosen to do, that you have a way to cover it up even after you're hired. And that can also go with facial hair or how long your hair is. In some positions, there are legal requirements for positions, and you may not be allowed to have facial hair, or your hair may not be allowed to be a certain length, or you have to be able to put it up because of certain safety regulations and things that exist out there. So if you're, for instance, if you're a chemical major and you're going into that type of field, a lot of times you have to be able to fit a respirator on your face. If you have to be able to fit a respirator on your face, then you have to be clean shaven. So that's an example of some of the things that you might encounter during the interview process. If you have facial hair and you're going for a position that requires something like that, you either A, want to shave beforehand, or B, make sure you say in the interview that it's not an issue for you, because that could stop you from getting a position, depending on what you... Oh, okay. If your job, though, does not require it, if it's not like, if there's not some safety regulation that requires it, then I would just make sure that that whatever you have looks appropriate. It looks neat, you look tidy, it doesn't look sloppy.
Okay.